So with that, I'm going to have Len and Matt come up and we can open it up for questions, whether it's about the research and the data itself, what it means, how we apply it, next steps, anything in that area.
I understand the growth has been this 70%, I guess, over the last 20 years, is it 15 years? But I'm also understanding that the number that was estimated in the year 2000 was based on only a survey that had 300 population.
Not quite. It was so the methodology of the 2000 survey. It relied on two different frames. As we mentioned, we used lots of different frames to collect the data. The estimate was based on one of the two frames, and that was the random digit dial segment of the study. The rest of the information that was collected in the study, it was another, I want to say 400 to 500 completed surveys. Everyone who completed the survey from that frame was on the Jewish Federation's mailing list. You can't really extrapolate basic demographic data using strictly a list-based approach. You have to have some way of randomizing the sample, and the random digit dialing segment was how it used to be done. That was still standard practice 10, 15 years ago. And that was 300 in the random digit dial segment, but there were another 300 or 400 in another frame as well.
So given that small population has been surveyed, how accurate would you then suspect that number was in order to get the 70% increase?
Our sense of things since January of last year, when we really started looking at the greater Seattle Jewish community, was that the 37,180 estimate from the 2000 to 2001 study was too low. Our sense of things was, in all likelihood, the group that was most likely to be missing from that estimate were the people who were least engaged in the community, because they're so hard to find for a study like this. To find somebody using random digit dialing, if the Jewish population is 2% of the population, you have to call 50 people to find one Jew. If you're talking to 50 people to find one Jew, you might have to call 500. So it might take 10 phone calls to get one person to pick up the phone. And you might have to make 10 phone calls to get somebody to pick up the phone. You could have to make 5,000 phone calls to find one Jew. So it's very difficult to do. And then when you supplement that only with the Federation's list, the people who are on the Federation's list are people who tend to be affiliated with Jewish organizations. Part of the strength of our method, going for lists from lots of different Jewish organizations, is that there are lots of organizations out there that serve members of the Jewish community who might not appear on somebody else's list, who might not be affiliated with other organizations. So we can get much better coverage of both the affiliated Jews and the wholly unaffiliated Jews using our newer methods.
But to answer the bottom line question, it's impossible to go back and figure out how many people were missed, which is why we say, yes, we found a 70% increase. Not exact. We probably missed people as well, people who were not.
At the end of the day, if it's a 50% increase instead of a 70% increase, as Matt said, it's all about the trend. The trend is that it's really a huge, significant increase. The other thing that really is significant about our study and what the Cohen Center did, our sample size was 3,058. Now, by itself, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. But if you overlay that with the sample size of the Pew study, which was for the whole country, that was about 3,475. So ours is not that much less than what the Pew study was able to use for the entire country. And from what Matt and Len have told us, our sample size is probably double or so what most normal study sizes would be now. So the data really is robust, which has allowed them to give a smaller confidence interval.
So I'm curious what you did with university students, because they're not, did you treat them as residents? Did you discount them?
So can you repeat the question? It's hard to hear.
Sure. So the question was, what did we do with university students? Did we count them as part of the community? Did we exclude them? This is always a tricky issue, and we gain people who maybe shouldn't be counted, and we lose people who maybe should, based on our methods. So there are many households in the community who claimed as members of the community their adult children who are off in college somewhere else, because those are still part of the household, they're still part of the family. We want them counted, and we let people include those children. There's really no harm in doing that. Those children still have some connection to the community. People who come here from elsewhere to study at the University of Washington or one of the other institutes of higher learning, they're much more difficult to find. If they're on Hillel's list, for example, we can find them, and then if we found them, they got into the survey, they would be counted. If we can't find them, if they live in the dorms, they're not on Hillel's list, they're not on anybody else's list, the ethnic name train isn't going to pick them up here, because if you live in an institutionalized setting, like a college dorm, you don't get picked up in the place where that institution is. You might get picked up where your family lives somewhere else. So we missed some of them as well. Graduate students are also tricky. We typically end up counting them if we find them, because I think it's a little bit of a different case from college students. They live in the community. They work here, they pay taxes, they take advantage of some of the programs. So it's, but we might miss them as well. It's always a tricky issue. To make it as simple as possible, we counted people if we could find them. There are clearly some people we didn't find. On balance, probably ends up about right.
I have a couple questions about the sampling framework. I want to mention that the 2001 study, which we did through Brendan Luciano, I recognize we can't do that anymore, sampled enough people until they could get stable estimates of population. So, in fact, one of the findings of the 2001 study, I don't recall the exact numbers, but there were a large number of what at that time were called unknown Jews, people who said they were Jewish and not completely unknown to the Jewish community. But in terms of sampling frame, when I was skimming through the full report, it mentioned that you used two sampling frames. One was the lists provided by agencies, and the second was last names. So in terms of lists, if I read it correctly, about 30 or so organizations gave lists out of over 100. So I don't know how you adjusted to that, or if that made a difference. And then in terms of last names, Seattle is somewhat unique. I guess distinctive, it can't be somewhat unique. It's distinctive in terms of high rates of intermarriage. So last names probably would have picked up Brendan O'Connor in my synagogue. Or there's a large number of Sephardic Jews in Seattle. And if you called somebody with the last name Calderon in Albuquerque, it would probably be Hispanic. Mexican would Calderon here, last name Jewish. So that would count.
So just real quickly, we didn't use last names, we didn't use what's called distinctive Jewish names, and in fact we know that distinctive Jewish names doesn't work any longer. So we buy lists from marketing research firms. It's not actually clear how they do it, how they identify them. They use first names, last names, education levels, income, and you get much higher hit rates. I forget what it was on the ethnic frame in this.
Ethnic name trains are a little tricky. They also have a behavioral component to them, the group that we went to. If you're posting constantly about Jewish issues on Facebook, they're going to pick that up. If you subscribe to a Jewish periodical, they're going to buy the subscription list. And that gets you added to the ethnic name train. If you hear music on Spotify, it's going to get you added to the ethnic name train. And even distinctive Jewish names lists, that is a component of this. It's not a perfect hit rate, but there's a distinctive Jewish names list for Sephardim as well. And that, I believe, is a component of it, because we found a number of Sephardic names on the ethnic names list that we received, and a substantial proportion of them were Jewish. I think we got responses. We had people try to participate in the survey. Something like 500 or 600 of them, and 123 of them turned out to be Jews who lived in the area, and they weren't on any other Jewish organizational list that we received. It's a substantial proportion, and because we know exquisitely how many Jews there are based on our meta-analysis, and we know exquisitely how many Jews are affiliated with these 40 or so organizations that provided lists, we can make a pretty decent estimate, just comparing those two numbers, how many are either they're affiliated only with the organizations that didn't provide lists, or they're not affiliated with any Jewish organizations at all. It's also worth noting that across a couple dozen studies of large Jewish communities over the past 30 years that have used a single list, the Jewish Federation's list, to supplement the RDD component of their studies, the Jewish Federation list has typically covered about 50% of the Jews in those local communities. What we find is when we collect lists from all the Jewish organizations, or at least from as many as are willing to contribute their lists, we get a coverage rate of 80 to 90%. And so it just makes it much more efficient to do the study that way. We can still account for probability of response given affiliation, lack of affiliation.
So I have a question. Here. Sorry, microphone is the question. So, after all this data, I have kind of a qualitative question, not a quantitative question, kind of a gut check. And that question is, knowing what you know about Jewish communal life, knowing what you know from studying all the places you've studied, were you living here, what would you be most excited about? And what would be causing you a little bit of heartburn?
Well, if I lived here, the first thing I'd have to say is that I like the weather. Any Jewish community that has wonderful weather like this and doesn't have it like my own community, place to live. I actually think the intensity of Jewish life in individual communities, the roles that synagogues play, is actually quite interesting and exciting. And I know if I were here, I have the hardest time finding a synagogue, I'm sort of part of a minyan, that I wanted to be part of. But I think I would naturally find a number of places here. I think the other side of it, and I'm a cynic skeptic. I always look at what you can fix. I like to find things that I can fix. What occurs to me is that you have a tremendous opportunity, and it's not just, it is partly a geographic issue, and it's partly getting programs to communities that don't have programs. But you have an extraordinary opportunity to reach out to populations that have not yet been touched. And that's about the quality of programs. And for me, it's about the connectivity of programs. You know, I was thinking as you were talking, it used to be that everything was set in motion. A child was born, particularly a male child, and from Brit Milah on everything, there was one ceremony every decade. So it was Brit Milah, and of course you had to send your child to Hebrew school so that they could celebrate Bar Mitzvah. And then in the 20s there was marriage, and so every decade.
And then childhood in the 30s.
And they have their own childhood, right? And so they have another Brit or naming ceremony in their 30s, and it goes on like that. Life isn't like that anymore. And so as I look at this community and look at the data, you've got this extraordinary opportunity to create an early childhood education environment that will attract a significant, an increased number of people. You have the potential, because you have so many people who are not part of the Jewish education system, to create educational programs. Now, the one thing I can say, and my teacher in this is a Federation CEO by the name of Barry Schrade in Boston. systemically. And I know many of you were involved in high tech, learning how to do this naturally. You can't just write a line of code. You can't just create a program that does one thing. It has to have an interface. It has to do something that a person wants, and so on. And I think what is the potential here is to create a system of educational programs and activities that will address the needs and interests of people from early childhood to childhood, to adolescenthood, etc. And if you do that, again, the potential is extraordinary.
I would actually agree with one on all of the policy issues. You can see the arguments we have about data and what it means. They're somewhat brutal, but on the policy issues, I completely agree with them. As far as what's surprising and would appeal to me if I lived here, I'm something of an expert on really small Jewish communities. There are more people in this room than there are Jews in the community where I grew up in Niagara Falls, New York. And so I spent much of my life being in places where there's no Jewish programming, there are no Jewish institutions. But there's something for everyone, there's something for every interest here. The difficulty, and this is the thing that would drive me nuts about living here, is that although there's something for everyone and there's everything under the sun, it might not be in a place that you can get to easily. Commuting drives me nuts. I recently bought a condo, and one of the reasons I liked it was because it cut my commute to work from 20 minutes to 10 minutes. And that was fantastic. But it takes 20 minutes to go a mile and a half here. That would drive me nuts. So I completely sympathize with those of you who are concerned about what that does to your programs and your institutions. But I think Len is correct. I think what Keith is talking about in terms of bringing community to the neighborhoods, bringing programs and interests and institutions where the people are, it's right on the money.
I have a question about if there are other Jewish communities across the U.S. that have similar characteristics as you're seeing in Seattle that we might be able to learn from how they share what we learn in terms of how they've addressed some of the issues and the opportunities.
I think Seattle's a unique place. I don't know of other large Jewish communities that have seen the influx of such a highly educated population. And you see in Florida where you've had communities grow rather rapidly over a relatively short period of time, but it's a different dynamic than it is here. At the same time, I think there's a lot to learn about from other communities that may be dissimilar about how to create meaningful education. So, for example, I started with early childhood education. I think a tremendous amount of progress has been made nationally on how to create meaningful programs for children, how to figure out how to engage families in them. I think there's a lot of work going on now at a slightly older age, how to develop youth groups and so on. And I think, given as someone noted in the question, the high rate of the high proportion of intermarried families, lots of interesting new ideas, even from dissimilar communities, about how to engage families. For me, the key to all of this, if I had is education, is Jewish education, increasing the quality of education. Your schools have to be better than the secular schools. They also have to be accessible, affordable, etc.
I was wondering if your survey, pardon my voice, I've got a frog in my throat. I was wondering if your experience gave you any insights about the extent to which, considering the diversity of the community, there were people doing what I'll call self-generated Judaism, self-generated Jewish life, my impression is that in Seattle there's been a kind of an explosion of very small, very non-institutional Jewish life, where people are really doing things on a very, very micro-neighborhood scale. And I was curious about your insights to that, and I'd be curious also to hear more about how to reach some of the people doing that, and what the tension or balance is between conventional institutions and self-generated Jewish life.
So actually, I've done a lot of thinking, not necessarily in the context of this study, about what's called DIY, do-it-yourself Judaism. And do-it-yourself Judaism is almost an oxymoron, because Judaism is about doing things like other people. It's about having dominion. It's about doing things collectively. So that said, large institutions, and we're in a large institution, is only one of the models for organizing a community. And I don't know if we picked up in the survey, so I'll let Matt speak to it. But clearly, I want to make a transition from a lot of what we heard from, we call them the JNRs in this study, was their Judaism was in themselves, and that they weren't engaged in the community, even though they felt that they were Jewish, that Judaism was important to them. All the stuff about how proud people are to be Jewish, regardless of how much people Jewish they do. So in other places, in other communities, and Matt can speak to some of the data that some of the responses people here, creating smaller communities, Minyanim, Chavurot, congregations that meet, whether it's just for holidays and special occasions, are one direction.
So it's hard to generalize about this, because what we tended to pick up on was so unique to the individual respondents. Among the 50 congregations that were specifically identified by people who indicated that they were members of a congregation, a synagogue, a minyan, a chavurah, there was one in particular, and I can't tell you exactly what the language was, because it would be a dead giveaway for whoever this person is. But it essentially came down to, this is a small group of people that meets in someone's basement, twice a month, maybe every week, for Shabbat morning services. That's not something that's going to be picked up institutionally. It's not an institution. It's just a bunch of people who, for whatever reason, decided that they would form their own minyan. It's a small group. Nobody knows about it. We have no way of knowing about it. If we hadn't randomly found this one person who's involved in it, and they said, I am a member of this particular group. We found a number of things like that. I think the one thing that we can generalize about from the data, a lot of people talked about volunteering as sort of a do-it-yourself Judaism kind of thing. Even the people who talk about, I do no volunteering under Jewish auspices for Jewish organizations, a lot of them talk about volunteering as a way for them to express their Judaism. They might not be volunteering with Jewish groups, they might not be volunteering on behalf of Jewish causes, but for them, volunteering is how they express their Jewish identity. It's about tikkun olam, it's about repairing the world, doing good things, solving social problems. And we see that over and over again in this data. It's especially true, we found in other studies, for young adults in particular, this may be the primary means of expressing Jewish identity for an awful lot of people. And so I think, if you want us to try to systematize what we are finding in this do-it-yourself realm, that's the one thing that stands out that we see over and over again. But we see religious groups that are just a collection of people who know each other. We see social groups. We see book clubs that are forming. I think one person, this is a couple months ago, I read this comment, but someone said something about a cooking class that had been arranged informally among a circle of friends who, I frequently said I have 30 different recipes for kugel from growing up in Niagara Falls. It was that sort of a thing. They organized this class where each person would teach the others a recipe for some Jewish food that was, I think it was thematic to Jewish holidays. So every couple of months when there was another holiday coming up, someone would teach a recipe. There's a lot of stuff like that going on around here. It's tough to pick up because it really does depend on who you get to do the survey, and that's a roll of the dice. But there's a lot of this going on, so your impression is right on the money.
And if you're asking how do you connect with them, part of it is, as Len was talking about earlier, creating the opportunities for education, particularly starting with early childhood, and as Matt was talking about, the volunteer opportunities. And when you overlay the two of them together, you really have an opportunity to engage them in something bigger and broader, because it's their children, it's education, and it's volunteering that are all important pieces to them.
I have questions related to education. The town that I came from was a Catholic family named Shapiro. So I know that's all about. But what I'm wondering is about education, when you talk about systemic education. I participated in the Milton program. I participated in the Wood program after the Milton program. I have done some continuing education at the university. I participated in the Endless Opportunities program in this community, which is for people my age and older and younger. And that is a wonderful way to tie people together and bring things out. But I'm wondering, how do you continue with when you have so many different organizations offering Jewish education? That's one of the reasons that I supported the Center for Jewish Studies at the university, because that to me is a synthesis and doesn't come with a particular religious bias, which I think is good, also birth rate. But do we know how long the effects of birthright last?
Yes.
How many years? How much does it bring people, young people into the community, and they stay the rest of their lives, and their children are Jewish?
That's a whole other discussion, but in fact, the effects of birthright appear to increase over time. So the further out you go, the effects on people, essentially birthright, the alumni of Tokli are much more likely to create their own Jewish families, raise their own Jewish children, and as adults engage in the community. I see we're losing people. I think we've gone past the time. I'm not going anywhere, so I'm happy to answer questions. But just very quickly on this notion of systemic education and what happens when we have a lot of organizations. Having a lot of organizations doing it is good because it gives people more opportunities and makes it perhaps more convenient for them. But what I was thinking about was how you can't think of each of the sectors of education as distinct and separate. So we have, on the one hand, overnight camps, summer camps for kids, and we have early childhood centers, and then we have supplemental schools, presumably in this building, among other places. And you have to think of that as a system, and you have to think of the parents of the children as a system, because if the parents themselves don't have Jewish education, then it's very hard for them to help their children both benefit from and feel a part of the education. So it's how all of these things are connected.
So I want to thank everybody for coming. Len and Matt will be out in the lobby if you want to talk with them a little bit more, if you have questions for any of us. and look forward to speaking a lot more as we begin to implement the changes in the study honors course.
Thank you.